Hello, chaps. I want to take a look through 5 Chinese blog articles. And hopefully, because they're actually in Chinese language, that means they are either the general Chinese point of view, which would be interesting because we don't know enough about that. It's always very important to consider what the Chinese think. Or it's actually someone's independent view, and because they are Chinese language, they occupy a different intellectual and cultural and media sphere than us, which means they will be, this is original. This is something a bit unique compared to us in the West. So I find this interesting. These 4 articles up in the bar here are like from the past few days. So they're going to be quite up to date. We'll see if they're interesting. This one is from a whole month ago. And the title is "The Russian Army has missed the best opportunity to win, and the Ukrainian army has performed better than expected." Obviously, that depends on what your expectations were. And the best opportunity to win, what was that? Like an immediate Ukrainian collapse, perhaps? So maybe this was just unrealistic expectations. People, including myself, actually thought that Ukraine would just collapse. Instead, its infantry is just fighting on and on and on, which is quite impressive in terms of their morale. But they're I feel like they're a bit bogged down. Like the enemy does have more firepower, and basically you just have infantry with anti-tank and anti-air missiles. So they can defend built-up areas, but they can't actually actively win the war. They can't push out easily, I don't think. So this first article, because we now have 4 weeks of hindsight on it, might be quite interesting. The point it was written, the Russians did continue to make advances for about several days afterwards, at least. So I'm just going to skim through it. You can slow down the video or pause it if you want to read it, or you can actually open up the links, which I will put in the description to this video. And as you can see, I'm using Chrome, which has an automatic translation option, but you can install browser translators extensions in most browsers. So with the current mobilization scale of the Russian army, it's difficult to ensure effective control of large cities, and that's true. A very fundamental thing to consider here is that Russia has only deployed a fraction of its forces. Russia has something like 3 or 4 times the population of Ukraine, but I think the deployed infantry on each side is basically even, to give you an idea of how that's working out. So, and a month later, this paragraph has aged extremely well, because the Russian attacks on various cities, they're not storming Kiev, they're not even trying. And the storming of Mariupol is a very careful, it's a very slow process. I don't know about careful. It's slow. And the same goes even more so for Kharkov, where not really sure what's going on there. So the most favourable choice for the Russian army is to quickly annihilate the heavy army group of the Ukrainian army in the field. And that means down here, opposite Donetsk and Luhansk, where before the Russian invasion, the Ukrainians were amassing to crush the rebels. And this is clearly something that's a lot more easy for the Russians to do. It is something that the Russians have been pursuing for a whole month since the writing of this article. So it's impressive just how slow it is. But I feel like at the same time, you might say, oh, it's taken them a whole month and they haven't won yet in a single battle in the open field. Well, maybe part of that is because Russia's deployment is limited, and also if the Ukrainians can't get this army back across the river, then assuming Russia is going to win eventually, then it doesn't need to win swiftly. And maybe it's actually much easier to wait for the Ukrainian force to have a harder time in terms of supplies if the Russians are effectively bombing supply chains, more so than the reverse. So let's continue. The most favourable... This is so fabulously optimistic, especially in retrospect. The idea that you can quickly end the talks and then just reconcile with the West. I mean, the West is deranged. To those of you who think that the Western sanctions are justified because it's so outrageous to invade a country, maybe that's true, but the West is also engaging in cultural cancellation, like renaming some celebration of Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, because they didn't want to acknowledge a Russian. Now, that shows a level of zealotry and fanaticism that has nothing to do with sabotaging Russia's economic ability to wage war. And by the way, sabotaging Russia's economy through sanctions is just an incredibly slow way to degrade their ability to fight the war. Russia doesn't run out of fuel. It doesn't run out of food, and it's not going to run out of basic ammunition either. So, it's, really we're just kicking ourselves in the nuts here in the West without actually hurting their ability to fight. And in fact, not only are we not able to directly affect Russia's economic ability to wage war, most Russians are blaming the West for the Western sanctions. And so these sanctions have actually reinforced Russian public opinion behind Putin and the military operation, because they feel accurately that their country is under attack by the West. So I'm very against these sanctions, even from the pro-Western perspective. I think they're a mistake. But let's continue reading the article. I promise you this video is going to speed up and we'll get through all 5 articles eventually. The entire military operation is limited to 1 week. Oh my goodness. It's the best economically, politically, and militarily. 2 weeks is still acceptable. Any longer, it will be very bad for Russia. Well, we're well past that point, and the dice have been thrown. Alea jacta est. Yeah, there is no collapse, and the strategic reserve of the Ukrainian army will be called out. That's probably a mistranslation at the end here. Because these 2 points are close to the border area, so... The actions of the Russian army confused many people at first, and that's because they went in at so many different places. And by the way, people are saying, oh, the Russians can't storm Kiev. But I think it's a tactic to place troops outside of Kiev, which aren't able to storm Kiev, but they're able to force the Ukrainians to garrison Kiev instead of sending reinforcements to the east. I think that's very sensible. I do that kind of thing in multiplayer strategy games myself sometimes, so it's very relatable. The Ukrainian army is clearly playing a game of cat and mouse with the Russian army. That's interesting. I don't know if that's a thing that happens like in the open field. Can you really run and hide in the open field? But it's certainly true in the cities, but that's more of a siege rather than a hide and seek, so I don't know. Curious. So they're saying the Russians don't have very good surveillance. That would make it more likely that the Ukrainians are doing hide and seek in the open field. And yeah, that's something to consider. That's what the Chinese are saying. And I have to say, I do think that this is a fundamental part of the war. The Western coverage is talking about how the Russians are just indiscriminately shelling cities and killing so many civilians. And they probably are killing quite a few civilians, quite a lot. But it's not indiscriminate shelling. It's motivated by tactical considerations. And I think in comparison to Western interventions, the Russians are tolerating a lot more of their soldiers dying and a lot less of enemy civilians dying. You compare it to the US-UK invasion of Iraq, and I heard someone claim that in Ukraine, 10 times fewer civilians have died at some comparable point, and 10 times as many Russian soldiers. So I think this narrative that the Russians are holding back their full firepower advantage had merit. It certainly had merit in the first week. Perhaps now that we're looking increasingly at actual sieges of cities, maybe it's less true. But this is a sentiment which I don't think Westerners should dismiss out of hand. So they're saying that the Russian army must lock in, must encircle the Ukrainian army before the Ukrainians can attack. And the Ukrainian army has to avoid being encircled. And a month later, I haven't heard much decisive things coming out of the Donbass front with this big field battle. And so clearly they maneuvered a lot, perhaps. This is just my theorizing off a couple of articles. I'm not certain. But it seems like maybe I heard there had been videos circulating of lots of Ukrainian soldiers dying in the field. I prefer not to watch videos of soldiers dying. So I don't know for myself, but maybe this is finally happening, but maybe for a month there's been just lots of maneuvers. Under this circumstance, NATO will help Ukraine establish an air defense system. I don't know if they're talking about directly, because obviously that hasn't happened. It probably isn't happening. If they mean supplying missiles, then that has happened to some extent. Yeah, the main geographical barrier is just the Dnieper River right in the center of the country. If NATO helps Ukraine strengthen its air defense system, it will limit the operational capabilities of the Russian military. And perhaps that has indeed happened. Like, the Russian airstrikes do seem to be limited compared to the use of artillery. Supposedly, now the article is talking about supplying aircraft. I think the aircraft have kind of been bombed by the Russians, though, because if you trundle them into the country on the ground, then they get bombed. If you fly them into the country, then you might be like entering the war. And also, the Russians destroyed the airports, the runways. So I think the Ukrainians still have an air force, but it's forced to basically hide. So this didn't happen. By the way, blood transfusions is like a Chinese idiom just meaning support, like welfare even. Blood transfusions. I mean, that's what Google Translate creates when I Google Translate Chinese, anyway. So NATO did arm Ukraine, and this is probably still ongoing. The matter will become clear in the next 72 hours. Well, maybe the answer to this question is that it is a failure if it had to be decided in 72 hours. If this analyst is correct and there's like a 72-hour window to do it in, then maybe it has been a Russian failure. I'm not sure about this. The performance of the Russian army on the battlefield is far worse than the predictions of all parties before the war. It might simply be that Ukraine had a huge amount of firepower and the deployed infantry, at least if not machinery, was kind of equal. So I'm not totally certain about that. And part of the reason I'm not certain about this is that the Russian troops go into Ukraine not allowed to have cell phones, so they weren't producing social media videos. The Ukrainians were. So when the Russians destroy a Ukrainian unit, it doesn't get posted online. When the Ukrainians destroy a Russian unit, it does get posted online. And I believe in some cases, when the Ukrainians come across a Ukrainian destroyed unit, they actually post it as a Russian destroyed unit. I think that's probably happened a few times as well. So I'm not certain if this sentence is accurate. It could just be the effect of a disparity in social media posts. And this is very true. At this point, Russia is, it's definitely committed to getting something from this war, and it's a huge deal on both sides in terms of this geopolitical conflict, and any kind of victory will be really paradigm changing. When you add it to the humiliating American exit from Afghanistan, it will really, there will be a global perception that the geopolitical axis has changed. So, without sounding callous, it's probably worth casualties. And that was another thing I forgot to mention. There's been reports that the Russians have had 17,000 dead at this point, and like 3,000 in the first week. The official Russian figure is 1,500, probably by like last week or something. Let's just say I think it's not 17,000 by any means. Now, this is an interesting point because I think the situation for Ukraine in the long term is hopeless, and I think Ukraine is, in the long term, the country that is going to lose in terms of its economy, its strategic position. I mean, Ukraine is the one that has Russians in its borders. Russia doesn't have Ukrainian troops guarding its power plants like the Russians guarding Chernobyl. The Russians could shut down Ukraine's power plants, that kind of thing. So I don't see how Russia can actively win the war against Russia. I don't see how Ukraine can do that. But it certainly can hold out for a very long time. It does have confidence, I believe. At least it has for the past month. Maybe that's changing now. We will see. I don't know. But this is a curious idea, the idea that the Russians could actually lose. Russia has fuel, it has food, and it has ammunition, at least the basic stuff, like I said before. And I think popular opinion is also very much behind the intervention. Now, you could say, well, the Russians will get tired of the casualties. They will turn against the war in due course. I feel like the recent videos of war crimes from the Ukrainians will actually reinforce popular Russian opinion, especially given what that implies about how Russian speakers and actual ethnic Russians are treated. If the POWs are getting shot to death or tortured, or if a dead Republic militiaman is having his mother phoned up to mock him for dying by a Ukrainian who killed him, that was a mess of a sentence. Let me say it again. And one of these war crimes that I saw, I consider it morally a war crime, even if it isn't technically, was a Ukrainian soldier using the cell phone of a slain Luhansk separatist rebel to call that guy who's dead, to call his mother and take the piss out of him. That's actually, I think that's actually worse than torturing someone to death with a machete or shooting them in the knees so they die of blood loss. I think calling their mother to make fun of them, I actually think that's worse in a sense. Like, and he was talking to this guy's mother and saying like, oh, there's only his leg and his arse left. He got blown up so much, incredible evil. And I'm getting off topic from the article, but that kind of evil behavior, I don't think it's typical of the Ukrainian troops in general. At least I hope not. I think it's more typical of certain elements of the Ukrainian army. You probably know which ones I'm talking about. The ones that have funny insignia, let's just put it that way. And military modernization has a long way to go. Well, that's true. I don't know what exactly they mean specifically. But, I mean, drones. Drones are still new. There is no cost-effective way to shoot down drones. And we have yet to see the emergence of fighter drones that are designed to shoot other drones down with small arms. That will be very funny. So, it's very important to maintain the status with nuclear weapons, but conventional military is more difficult. And that's very true, because a nuclear weapon system is basically just a nuclear weapon system. You do need air defense or anti-missile defense, and maybe you do need to have enough to get past the enemy's missile defense, and you need first strike monitoring, and you need submarines, and you need mobile. You need vehicles that have nuclear weapons on, so that the enemy can't just know where all of your silos are. You have to have them moving around. So there's certainly complexity to nuclear weapons, but it's still a kind of one-note thing. It's just a nuclear weapon. It does one thing. You fire it somewhere and it explodes. Conventional military is just incredibly complex in comparison. Anyway, that is the first of these 5 articles from a whole month ago, and it's kind of interesting to compare and contrast. Next up is ones that are in the past few days. Who is the master of mobile warfare between the Russian and Ukrainian armies? The answer will still be revealed. It hasn't been revealed yet. And bear in mind, you had those comments in the first article about the Ukrainians and the Russians maneuvering around. The Russians were trying to trap the Eastern Ukrainian army, and the Eastern Ukrainians were playing cat and mouse. So clearly that topic hasn't died or been concluded yet. And it seems like the writer of this blog has actually started to appreciate in the past month things that I have also appreciated in the past month. The idea that Russia doesn't need necessarily to win a complete head-on victory immediately, because he's talking about squeezing battlefield space and controlling the hub city. It's not the same as storming the place. So yeah, ceasefire talks, I don't think they're genuine at this point. We don't really need to talk about that. What's this crap now? How do I read the whole... Okay, there we are. No! I'm clicking too much. Good, right. Okay, so they control the Sea of Azov because they have Mariupol under siege, and they have therefore this corridor. Kind of curious that they don't control this hinterland. It's kind of weird how that works. Like, are the Ukrainians really garrisoning this exact spot, or is it just like doesn't have roads built in it or something? So they're talking about Mariupol. It's no longer a quick and direct capture of Kiev and Kharkov. And see, this is quite questionable. You know, I think maybe the Russians did want to have the Ukrainians surrender and like collapse in terms of morale and organization, but they never actually had the forces deployed. Like they say right here, they never actually had the forces to storm Kiev. And it seems like they are working on Kharkov now. But it's no longer, they're saying it's no longer a quick and direct capture of Kiev. Well, what if it never was? You know, you're saying here that they don't have enough to storm it. So why are you saying that they ever planned to if they never actually brought enough men? I mean, Russia has chosen how many men it's deploying into Ukraine, and they have more that they could deploy. So maybe this was never their plan. It's just something to consider. Control the transportation hub cities along the Dnieper River. So when it said control the hub earlier, that was actually the Dnieper River. Interesting. Because we haven't heard much about... Okay, we have heard about these. Kherson, which is here. Zaporozhye, which is where that second nuclear power plant scare happened. And Dnieper... Didn't this change its name? I think this had a name change at some point. It was something a bit easier. Dnipropetrovsk, what a mouthful. And Poltava, which doesn't actually look like it's close to the river, but whatever. Kherson's battle is fairly minor. I think that's changed. Oh, this is actually from the 2nd of March. So this is actually only... We've only gone a week ahead of in time. But the war has been so slow for the past month in terms of map drawing that... I don't think it's out of date. I mean, this hasn't gone out of date. This sentence is still completely true. Kherson is quite minor, which is over here. It's too far from the two key points of Kiev and Kharkov. I mean, it's not really relevant to the encirclement, the attempted encirclement over here. Yeah, like it says, it's not immediately relevant. So, and the same, if that's true of Kherson, it's even more true of Nikolaev. Nikolaev is the Russian name, Mykolaiv is the Ukrainian name. So, so they failed to escape from Kharkov and maybe even Nikolaev. Is that what they're saying? That's interesting. So now it's Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye, which are important, but I don't think they've conquered them a month later even. And this has an interesting... no, scratch that. Fight hard militarily. Evacuate. Well, it definitely didn't evacuate. And it would have been dangerous to evacuate because it could be a total collapse as they fled. Now we're talking about counterattacks, attempting bargaining chips on the negotiating table. And this was almost a whole month ago, and nothing's changed. Like, have they fought hard? Have they counterattacked? I'm not sure. I think maybe. It's probably gone back and forth. And already on the 2nd of March, this Chinese blog was saying, Kiev is not a direct face-off. It's peripheral transport hubs. And meanwhile, a lot of the Western media has given the impression that there's fighting in Kiev because that's where the journalists are. And it's been kind of stupid seeing that. So that was not a very interesting or conclusive article, but we've got a few more. This one is from the 3rd. I didn't know about electric shocks from Azov. Goodness. Extremism spawns the flowers of evil. Goodness. So this is like the people with the funny insignia I mentioned earlier. Oh, for heaven's sake, I have to keep clicking these damn buttons. No! So yeah, it started out as kind of its own paramilitary, then it's integrated to an extent into the general military, I believe. And I didn't actually know this, so I'm going to read this in full. Its history goes back to the 82 faction, a football club founded in 1982. So this football club opposed the Russian interference, or just the Russian separatists, back in 2014. And then you get this kind of rather questionable stuff. And that's actually a Sonnenrad. Goodness, I forgot about the Sonnenrad in the background. So you can't trust these people to be nice to Russian speakers or Russian civilians. So if they're acting up and if they're a part of the Ukrainian government, eventually it's morally speaking, it's kind of justified for Russia to come and crush them, considering their standards of behavior. So these Azov guys, since 2014, apparently got paid triple the salary, so they're kind of an elite. And I heard the theory that they were distributed through the rest of the army to ideologically strengthen it. Torture of civilians, and okay, that was back in 2014 and 15. So I'm not sure if they were doing this consistently since then. Electrocuted, waterboarded. Goodness, I don't necessarily believe the United Nations human rights unequivocally, but this is kind of grisly. The thing is, like, I wouldn't necessarily mind neo-Nazis existing. Maybe not even in a country's armed forces, but when they're in a ethnic conflict with Russians, who the Third Reich was not very nice to, then you have a problem. Just like if there are neo-Nazis in a place that has Jewish civilians, well, then you might have a problem with their behavior, to say the least. And this article's doing a roll call of all the most famous quotes and unfortunate photos from the Azov battalion. Stepan Bandera, yeah, you've got all the classic stuff, Nuremberg trials. Give me some more. Give me some more modern news. This is hilarious. They banned the Americans banned supporting Azov battalion. Then they reenacted support. Then they banned it again, and then they lifted it again. Actually, that's so typical of the Trump administration. But it's also true of, like, because American administrations under both Trump and Biden are just like decentralized. You have different departments, different politicians vying for control of policy, and that's why it flicks backwards and forwards like that. Which, by the way, you might look at this and say, wow, they're funding Nazis, that's so outrageous. But I see something else that is outrageous, which is that a democratically elected government cannot have a consistent policy because of factional infighting. So it's kind of a fake democracy, and I find that outrageous as well. And this is hilarious. Facebook banned users from supporting it, but then it lifted it. It's so funny. Yeah, Bashar al-Assad had a speech recently where he was saying, like, the West doesn't have any principles. It's just about whether you support or oppose them, and I think we're seeing some examples of that. So this article again was just about the neo-Nazis. My comment on this should be that these are Chinese, so the Chinese aren't like obsessively against neo-Nazis. They're not. The Third Reich is not that important to Chinese history compared to American or German or whatever. They understand the concept because of the whole because they were in the Second World War against the Japanese, who were brutal as well. But, Japanese Empire was not quite the same as the Third Reich, even if they were allies. So, yeah, the Chinese aren't going to be that crazy about it. I think they're just being reasonable. Excessive use of chopsticks is harmful to health. Should I click on it? Nah. Let's go on with the articles. And now, we're only a week ago now. So you see how there's been a kind of evolution in this blog. It started out by saying the Russians have failed to win and the Ukrainian army is performing way better than expected. And then it was, oh, well, there's still a lot of maneuver going on. And that's the Russian strategy. And by the way, look at these neo-Nazis. And now we're on to appreciating the Russian concepts and the Russian strategic ideas. The frontline battle is still unclear, very true. But the military operations of the past few weeks are of great reference value for any modern warfare researcher. Lots of false information on both sides, although I'm sure in terms of sheer scale, the Western side has far more false content. And we don't have that much. I think what they mean by this made it impossible for researchers to avoid drawing self-contradictory conclusions. I think the correct machine translation of this would be, you don't have context, so if you draw any conclusions, it's very easy to fall into like a self-sustaining narrative or circular logic, because you don't have something to, if there's lots of variables at play, so you would need to have another modern conflict to compare any given situation to identify which factor actually made the difference. And therefore, if you just analyze it off a couple of examples, you end up with like circular logic. So this blog has actually gone through the campaign, like the strategic concepts published in Russia in the past 10 years, and it's comparing and contrasting that with what they've actually achieved in Ukraine. So that's going to be quite interesting. So they're saying that it's very different to the American modern war. And if I had to guess, I would say that the Russian approach is maybe more based on maneuver, and it's not based on having total dominance, whereas the Americans are just based on like, America, fuck yeah, bomb everything to shit before you move in. That would be my guess, to put it very crudely. American lion fighting the rabbit, that fits with what I just said. Tianji's horse racing. Let's actually Google search Tianji. Tianji's horse racing is a story in one of the greatest Chinese literature's records of the Grand Historian. So Tianji was racing a horse with someone who had better horses. Sun Bin. Oh, okay. Good, better, and best. 3 rounds. And the winner is the one who wins 2 rounds. And right now, both of them are using their good horse for the opponent's good horse. Better horse. Okay, so this is the concept that, you're not a lion fighting a rabbit. You don't have the ability to win at all points all the time. So basically, the concept here is going to be, when the enemy has a strong point, you avoid it, and you try to focus overwhelming force on their weaker points. Basically, that's all it is. And so the analogy of the Gulf and Iraq War is not ideal, because the balance of power is actually quite similar between Ukraine and Russia. Quantitative advantage of 3-1 in Iraq. In the Russia-Ukraine war, it's more like 1-1. And there's not much qualitative difference in either. I mean, the Russians do have a superiority, I'm sure, in terms of air power, and certainly the long-range missile strikes. And wonder weapons like the Kinzhal hypersonic stuff. So the US, when you have overwhelming force, your strategy is not how can we win, it's how can we avoid taking any casualties as we win. Russian idea is much different. It's not how can we avoid having casualties, it's how can we win at all. And we are going to lose some battles when we win a war. That's basically the idea. Only about 120,000 to 180,000. Oh, plus tens of thousands of guards. Oh, and as well as these. Okay, the two Russian republics definitely bring it up to 200,000. Yeah, and yeah, okay. So if anything, Ukraine might even have more troops. So yeah. So this means, in Tianji's horse racing analogy, the Russians can't put their good horse against the other side's good horse, or you're just looking at a draw. They have to put their good horse against the other person's average horse. So I think this Dongwu cluster is the Ukrainian army's anti-terrorism operation. It was called the ATO, which was deployed against the Donbass. And Russia did not put its western and southern military regions. I don't know what that means. Maybe it's divisions. Maybe it's describing where they were put here. So they actually put the DPR and LNR militiamen. Now, the thing is, this article is describing the DPR and LNR militiamen as not elite, but actually they probably are, because they've been fighting for a long time and they have high morale, even if their training and equipment isn't as good as the regular Russian army. I mean, they have actually been trained probably by Russian special instructors sent across the border in the past 8 years. So I'm not sure I actually agree with this. But let's entertain it. For the sake of this article, let's just say, okay, the LNR and DPR, let's say they're very good man for man, but maybe there's not as many of them. It's not the huge firepower of the full Russian army. We don't know how integrated Russian fire support is with the LNR and DNR. Let's just entertain what it's saying. So let's just agree that they engaged the cream of the Ukrainian army with actually Russia's weakest troops. And that would actually fit with Russia not making much progress at all in the Donbass, compared to other parts of the country where it was carving out huge swathes of territory. I mean, even a week or two ago, Donetsk was still getting bombarded. Yeah, so preserving your most elite forces is a cold but logical choice. Yeah, that's true. Relying on very limited support. Well, we don't really know how much the Russians have supported the militias, but it seems probably to have been borne out by events. Antique models. Unsuitable for modern battlefields. I guess this is maybe an explanation for the Ukrainians having all of this crappy equipment. I mean, if you're not going to use it now, to put it bluntly, then when are you going to use it? And in a way, the fight against the enemy's elite force is something you want to leave to last, because it's difficult and you want to see if you can get a stronger strategic position before you try and wipe them out. So what vehicles are you going to commit there, along with the rugged militiamen? It would be the crap stuff, quite logically. And that's a very different explanation from the Western narrative that Russia is just a backward shithole. And Russia is a backward shithole in comparison to somewhere like Germany or even the USA, despite leaving aside some places like Chicago, whatever. This is a very different narrative that they actually have a logical reason. And something I have a problem with people describing Russia as a shithole, because if Russia is so backward, Russia has 2 or 3 times the GDP per capita of Ukraine. So if you describe Russia as very backward, then that means you have an even lower opinion of Ukraine, logically, unless you're just being bigoted and sort of hateful towards Russians. Yeah, Russia's perception of war and the price it's willing to pay are indeed very different. So there's been this narrative that the Russian Navy is too small and old, but, it's actually... They moved a lot of them from the Baltic and the North into the Black Sea, and they cooperated with the Air Force to destroy the Ukrainian Navy, and they did that very swiftly. We never heard anything from the Ukrainian Navy. 3 ships in the Mediterranean faced off with the USS Truman. I didn't hear about that. Repeating the thrilling confrontation in the Eastern Mediterranean in 1973. Maybe that means Israel versus Egypt. Oh my goodness, are they referring to the USS Liberty getting bombed by Israel? I don't know. That's funny if they are. Anyway, so they did make an amphibious landing in Melitopol. That was in Azov, so okay. And it cut off the retreat of the Ukrainian army, or at least one of their routes. That's interesting. Where is Melitopol, actually? If it's a threat to Odessa, it must be quite far to the west. Okay, so Melitopol is threat to Odessa? How is that a threat to Odessa, man? Maybe they hadn't taken Kherson when they took Melitopol, and yeah, I don't know about that. Whatever. I mean, it has become true since then that I believe. Oh, hang on, no, they're not saying the Melitopol. The but also is not referring to the amphibious landing in Melitopol. It's referring to the subsequent operations of the Navy. And this is something I have heard from other sources as well. Like the Russian positions near Kiev, the menace of the Navy near Odessa means the Ukrainians have to hold back some of their troops within Odessa away from the active front line. So, like it says, difficult to assist other besieged areas. Yeah, this missile strike was pretty huge, but you've probably heard about that elsewhere. Special Forces operation mode of reconnaissance behind enemy lines. That's very interesting. Yeah, here we go with what I was saying earlier. The US combat mode of long-term fire preparation. Apparently the Americans bombed Iraq for a whole month before entering the country. Very, very different to this. And people are saying the Russian offensive was too reckless. Well, it was a risk, and it was costly, but it appears to have paid off. It's not a temporary thing. This author is saying it's actually part of a plan. They immediately obtained certain positions on the ground. The air defense networks still exist in Ukraine, but they can't cause obstruction to the specific operations on the first day. Not sure I understand that. That's a pretty cool photograph. They allowed Melitopol to watch Russian TV. It's kind of funny. They conducted weapon buybacks in controlled areas. That's interesting, because the Ukrainians had been distributing weapons. Actually, I saw a video of this happening. But I don't think people ever wanted to engage in a guerrilla war against the Russians. Like, the stakes aren't that high. It's not like Islamists versus the Satanic America. If Ukraine and Russia aren't that different. So that's why they gave the guns in. Now, this is an interesting point. So it's widely believed that the United States ended the war in 22 days with the surrender of the Baghdad government. But actually, the US military hadn't been able to storm any major cities. They hadn't been able to destroy, presumably, the infantry arsenal of the Iraqi army. And the Iraqi army was able to disperse into the subsequent insurgency. Now, that's interesting. So Russia hasn't actually fallen behind the comparative schedule with the American invasion of Iraq from that perspective. Not from the diplomatic perspective, but from that perspective. And now the last of these 5 articles. Russian generals suffered an unprecedented rate of casualties. Now, when I heard about the Russian generals getting shot all the time, I wasn't sure whether to believe it. It sounds like an easy propaganda target. You just claim that someone has died. And I think there was a Chechen called Tushayev who was claimed to have been killed, and he actually hadn't been, for example. The problem of military reform broke out during combat. Russian army's command and communication system is backward and easily, spied on. More Russian general. I'm going to believe that Mr. Ayan of Phoenix Military has verified these deaths. So I'm just going to believe him when he says that more generals are dying than during Barbarossa, and possibly that's because their exact locations are getting spied on or something. That might be interesting, and maybe they get killed by Ukraine's artillery. But it isn't 7 out of 20 Russian generals, because that number came from Ukraine. It was actually 50. Okay. So NATO intelligence. Apparently it's NATO that's able to pinpoint these commanders for the Ukrainians to kill. That's quite interesting. So this article is implying that these 2 figures are separate, in which case it's 2,000 deaths on the part of the Russian army. But that was by March 25th, so been a few more days since. So it's at least 2,000 that have died, possibly up to 20,000 if you believe the Ukrainians, but I don't, to put it simply. 300 casualties per day. How does that add up? I can't do maths anymore. 9,000 supposedly. I don't believe that. This is more or less trustworthy. I mean, you would expect more Ukrainians to die because the Russians do have more firepower. So 2,000 Russians, 14,000 Ukrainians. That seems a bit questionable. Is their kill death really that great? I'm not sure. But the Russians probably are getting far more use out of their air force, for example. So, yeah. Huh, that's pretty funny. So the Ukrainians are claiming like 2,000 dead. The Russians are claiming that they've lost 2,000. So both of the sides in this war are saying that they've lost 2,000 and the other side has lost 16,000. That's quite amusing. And a 1-to-1 exchange ratio with the Russian army doesn't seem to be in line with the current battlefield situation. However, you might believe the Russians on the overall casualty figures, but maybe the 7 generals dying means that there is more than 2,000 Russian casualties. That's what this guy's saying. Now, what is the reason for it? We've got some historical context which you can read. I'm not going to bother. So we've got Sukhovitsky, Gerasimov, Kolesnikov, but it's not been confirmed by Russia. Mityayev, Modvichev, and Rezantsev. And that's it. Oh no, we've got another. Donetsk. Okay. Yeah. Loss rate of the commander of Russian combat corps is close to 20%. I guess not. Then I don't. if you believe the Ukrainian allegations, then Russia is losing more troops than they lost when they fought in Ukraine in the Second World War, which I think is very dubious. Russian soldiers captured in the Battle of Kiev in 1941. That's odd. Why weren't they tortured to death? Maybe neo-Nazis have become actually worse in the past 80 years. So Russia has a lot of generals compared to other armies, and they have a high rate of participation in combat operations, and they have insecure communications. And according to a number of troops, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is the biggest military operation since World War II. That's interesting. So it's actually bigger than the Korean Civil War, bigger than Vietnam. I'm not sure. That's very interesting. It really is big news then, and it's certainly reshaping the global economy with all of these stupid sanctions interfering with the fuel supply. So Russia has 350,000 troops mobilized, I would guess. It certainly has more in reserve, like for conscription or whatever. So the situation of the Russian army with these dead generals isn't bloated structure or system corruption, it's military reform. I'm not sure really what their point is. Having lots of generals that actively participate and get killed on the front lines actually seems like a good thing to me. So that's the fifth article. That was from 8 hours ago. And this is actually something that I should have looked at. How long can Ukrainian TB2 drones keep destroying Russian anti-aircraft missiles? And the problem is that apparently the drones are cheaper than the missiles that are used to kill them. So that's pretty dangerous. So Turkey couldn't import American drones, so it started assembling its own. I don't know if Turkey is actually making its own or if it's part. I mean, it must be partly using Chinese components because that's just how the world works. Yeah. Okay. Here it actually shows you. Like I was wrong. It's not Chinese at all. Okay, it's British, American, Canadian, German, and Austrian. Oh man, that's pretty cool. So I was shitting on the Turks, but come to think of it, it's Turkish drones in Ukraine. It was Turkish drones used by Azerbaijan in the 2020 war in Nagorno Karabakh, and in 2019 the Libyan government, by which they mean the Western Libyan government in Tripoli, used TB2 airstrikes on LNA controlled air bases, which is the Eastern Libyan government, which is aligned with Egypt and Russia. So the Turks have just been shitting on Russia quite a lot. This is now the third war where the pro-Russian side, or actually the Russian side, is getting under attack by Russian-made drones. Man, the Turks really piss everyone off, and they seem to be getting away with it. But the Turkish economy isn't doing so hot, so maybe they'll get their just desserts for all of this meddling. Yeah, and it's been used in the Civil War, and goodness, it's proliferating. AI intelligence and pattern recognition is insufficient. So what's it saying? What's the narrative? Are drones better against terrorists and militia, or is it better against a full army? In the anti-terrorist battlefield, a single UAV is very useful for reconnaissance. I'm not sure what side he's going with there. It sounds like... It sounds like it's saying that a regular army can kill it with anti-aircraft artillery and missiles. It has a lot of record against anti-aircraft missiles, and there's a high probability that the old cat was napping and being played by mice. That's clearly another lovely Chinese expression. No, we can't find it. That's not going to give us Chinese poetry, it's too general. Shoulder-fired air defense missiles are not high enough altitude. Hunting turkeys versus hunting chickens. Goodness, I can't understand these Chinese idioms. Okay, so the rapid fading. So what they are saying is that the drone is great versus a low-quality infantry guerrilla force, but against a regular army, they're saying it does get shot down. Okay. And it's saying that even China, which has way more satellites that Turkey doesn't, it still has a limited ability to set up mass communications for every drone. And you need a lot of autonomy. Interesting. If the TB2 is a business card, China's drone world is a huge mural. I don't think we've seen like a mass deployment of Chinese drones fighting for Russia, but if Russia keeps getting into conflicts, then I think we will. We'll see them using just an incredible swarm of Chinese drones. So yeah, that's just taking a look at what the Chinese are saying. And to be honest, they must be mostly consuming Western media, because most media in the world is Western, and it's the West which is obsessed with what's going on in Ukraine. So maybe that's why I saw a lot of points, especially in this article, that I'd seen elsewhere in Western media. Yeah, that's just a funny... I just thought it'd be interesting to make that kind of video about, like, what do the Chinese have to say?